Okay. All right, this week we've got Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg. This is a pamphlet published in either 1899 or 1900, something like that. So it's basically a long, well, short by some standards, I suppose, but it's a rebuttal to mostly Edward Bernstein and his reformist theory, quote unquote, basically explaining why his opportunism is cool and good. And she's saying, nope, that doesn't make any sense. And you're not a real socialist because you're sabotaging the cause for your own purposes. So yeah, she basically is gonna break down a lot of his arguments to bare bones and dismantle them. That's kind of the purpose of this text. So hopefully it's
Question.
good learning. Yes.
I thought this book was literally a book and not a mere pamphlet like that small.
It's
I thought that
usually. I mean, I know.
Yeah, but we are socialists. We read Das Kapital. This is a pamphlet for us.
Yeah, Das Kapital is a book. This is a pamphlet by comparison. But I think the other reason it was called a pamphlet is just because that's how it was originally distributed. Was they would just hand it out as like, I don't know, maybe it can be condensed more densely in German or something. I'm not sure.
I don't know. In Arabic, it's like 90 pages or something like that. So
that's about the same as the English one. Yeah, it's about 80 or 90 pages.
Yeah.
But no, the name of the just calling it a pamphlet doesn't diminish it. Obviously, most of the time you're going to read it. It's just a short book, or I know of my paperback copy is it's actually just one part of a longer book, with other writings from Rosa. So yeah, it's not super long, basically. All right, well, here are the different chapters. We'll kind of walk through them. Okay, so first we got the Opportunist Method. So she's going to start out by just kind of like, think of it as like her thesis out in front. What is Bernstein up to, basically? And the first thing she points out is that fundamental to Bernstein's argument is that he does not believe that contradictions will lead to its own collapse. But he does sort of still acknowledge that it will lead to some socialization of production and will also increase class consciousness over time. And I guess the quote where she summarizes this really quickly is, he says that capitalist development does not lead to a general economic collapse. He does not merely reject a certain form of the collapse, he rejects the very possibility of collapse. So what Bernstein's going to try and lay out as from the opportunist point of view is that capitalism is more than capable of either attenuating or overcoming its own internal contradictions, and that this is not a problem, I guess, and it won't lead to any sort of collapses. And I think he even basically suggests that economic crises are a thing of the past. And this is about 30 years, let's call it, before the Great Depression. So clearly he was wrong. And obviously there's been lots and lots of recessions and depressions since then. So before this and after this, it's been a pretty consistent cycle. So Bernstein just immediately rejects out, as one of his foundational bases, and that's very unsupported by the evidence. All right, so next, what are the opportunists trying to do with this? So she says revisionist theory thus places itself in a dilemma. Either the socialist transformation is, as was admitted up till now, the consequence of the internal contradictions of capitalism, And with the growth of capitalism, will develop its inner contradictions, resulting inevitably at some point in its collapse. In that case, the means of adaptation are ineffective and the theory of collapse is correct. Or the means of adaptation will really stop the collapse of the capitalist system and thereby enable capitalism to maintain itself by suppressing its own contradictions. In that case, socialism ceases to be a historic necessity. It then becomes anything you want to call it, but it is no longer the result of the material development of society. So she's pointing out where, like, basically, if you start to take this revisionist or opportunist or reformist, they're kind of all used interchangeably. If you take this perspective that basically we can reform our way out of capitalism, then you are basically abandoning socialism as a historic necessity. This is something that needs to happen in order to overcome capitalism. You're basically saying, actually, capitalism can just fix itself if it just gets creative enough, if it just has the right political system to manage all these contradictions. Right? Don't worry, it won't self-destruct. It won't create the conditions for its own overthrow. It's all fine and good. So that's maybe a little bit of a red flag. If
basically breaking the laws of capitalism to sustain it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of, this is where she's pointing out this contradiction, and this is more of, again, sort of reference back to the philosophical definitions of contradiction. There's logical contradictions where two things can't be true at the same time, and then there's also the dialectical definition of contradiction, which is more like, it's usually how Rosa is going to use it, which is two opposing forces. And this is usually what she's talking about here. It's inner contradictions, for example. That is like the inner struggle that defines capitalism, for example. Now, there's lots of them. Capitalism has loads of contradictions, but there are some that are more foundational than others. So one of the inner contradictions, for example, that we're all quite familiar with is between wage labor and capital. Pretty foundational to the whole system. But it is indeed a contradictory relationship between the two. And what Bernstein suggests, and she breaks all this down, of course, is that despite these internal contradictions, which are that define the economic system of capitalism, it also has means of adaptation, apparently, that can just subvert this, internal contradiction. And I think what she's pointing out here is that, well, either you can't really have your cake and eat it too. You got to go one way or the other. Either you fully embrace the definition of capitalism that has all these internal contradictions, or you just basically come up with an idealistic version of capitalism that doesn't. And you can't really just pick and choose. You can't have the contradictions and the means of adaptation, which suppress the contradictions. It's got to be one or the other. Because as far as we know, there are these means of adaptation, and she breaks all this down, pretty thoroughly, which is what he thinks are adaptations are really just manifestations of the exact same internal contradictions. In fact, when she gets into credit and cartels, or as Lenin would also refer to them as monopolies, I think we should know by now that the credit system and monopoly does not fix capitalism. That should be really obvious by now. And yet Bernstein is arguing along those lines regardless. All right. Let's talk about these quote-unquote adaptations. All right, so credit crises and cartels are some of the things he points to as evidence that capitalism is able to adapt, and not self-destruct. So she takes down credit first by saying credit strikes from two sides. After having, as a factor of the process of production, provoked overproduction, credit as a factor of exchange destroys during the crisis the very productive forces it itself created. At the first symptom of crisis, credit melts away. It abandons exchange where it would still be found indispensable, and where it still exists, it appears ineffective and useless, and thus it reduces to a minimum the consumption capacity of the market. So let's just think about this, right? We are probably about to go through another economic crisis very soon. And we can think to ourselves, like, what does credit do, first of all? So credit, as she indicates here, it plays a role in the process of production by providing capital to make production happen, right? So if I want to get into business, I want to start a business, usually I'm not just going to have the capital that needs to make that happen like on hand. Usually most people don't just have a bunch of money laying around doing nothing that they can just turn into capital and get a business going. Most of the time, that gets started by taking out a loan of some sort. And this is where the credit system comes in. You're basically borrowing money to make some production happen. Now, she says that this provokes overproduction. Okay, why is that the case? Well, we know capitalism has these crises of overproduction, but how does credit play a role in that? Credit plays a role because let's say that you are some genius, and I'm using that facetiously, but you notice some quote unquote hole in the market, some unmet demand, let's say, and you want to jump on the opportunity quickly. So you take out, like I said, you don't have time to make your money in production. You need money now so you can buy the equipment, hire the technical personnel, whatever it might be, to fill that hole in the market. And to do that quickly, to take advantage of the competitive advantage it will give you, you have to take out some credit. Now, the reason I said that you're not, or I'm saying it facetiously that you're a genius, is that these quote unquote holes in the market or available demand is usually noticed by many people simultaneously. And lots of different capital will basically move in to take advantage of potentially high windfall profits. And this is what causes overproduction in a certain sphere of the economy. Right. So let's see. I'm trying to think. I mean, how the housing market is a pretty classic example where if you if you basically have like a new city or something, or newish, and let's say a big factory moves into town, they're going to need workers, but they don't have the housing to put anyone. So a bunch of contractors will all flood in and basically flood the market with all this like housing, and they've basically oversaturated the supply, which is going to cause a crash in the prices, and boom, they're not able to realize the profit from their production. So
Exactly.
yeah,
And another thing that the credit system is responsible of is basically taking the money from the poor and funding the rich with it, which will widen the social, disparity between the ruling class and the ruled class.
Yeah.
By basically you having to give your money to the bank, and then the bank gives you nothing while loaning your money to the local capitalist.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Because usually the people who need to borrow money, surprise, don't have very much. Obviously, they need it for something. So those who have less are the ones taking out credit. And this is where she's basically telling us this doesn't fix anything. It only makes existing problems worse. Okay. And again, this is what she means by it's the same old contradictions rearing their head. It's a slightly different form, but ultimately it's the same process happening. And again, like, the credit might facilitate the creation of these productive forces. Like I said, maybe you need to hire technologists or just buy a bunch of stuff to make all this cool machinery, let's say. But then, as soon as there's a crisis, production becomes a waste of money because there's a huge lack of effective demand. You can't sell any of your stuff. And so all that productive forces, it just goes to waste. And also, you might have a situation where, let's see, banks do a lot of lending. So let's say the bank, they call in their loan because they're also hurting during the crisis. And now what are you going to do? You got to maybe sell the force of production to repay the loan, whatever it might be. So, and then again, the second part is kind of similar here.
Here we are followers of the Deprogram podcast, and in memorization of that, let's just say it's a snake that eats its own ass.
Yeah, that does tend to happen.
Even though I would argue that the social struggle that would happen through the disparity between the rich and the poor has a larger effect, but I don't see the effect in first world countries as much as I see it in third world countries, where when you have the credit system, you would see the large disparity between the rich and the poor.
Yeah, I mean, this text does get into the international element a little bit, but not nearly as in depth as Lenin does in Imperialism. But it's actually kind of interesting reading this text directly after Imperialism, because there's a lot of parallels in how they're both analyzing the situation, which is pretty interesting to see. Another thing I'll point out, right, at the first symptoms of a crisis, the credit melts away. We are seeing this literally like in action right now, because the forecasters of doom are, when there's a forecast of impending crisis, and this she calls like the first symptoms, which when she says credit melts away, it's what we're seeing now when, for example, interest rates go up, right? That makes it way less attractive to take out loans, because why would you take out a loan at a higher interest rate? And it kind of makes sense. Like, if during a crisis, it's kind of caused by everyone holding onto their money and not circulating it properly so that the capital can keep flowing. It's more like everyone goes full on, hold their money. It's a time where like nobody's lending. Like, why would you lend during a crisis? That's not what happens. And so, yeah, during a crisis, credit melts away. And like she says, it's where people need it the most, they can't find it, right? Because when people are really hurting during a crisis, they really need money badly, no one's lending. And so where it is indispensable, you can't find it. And where you do find it, it's ineffective, because again, unless you have assets on hand, no one really believes your credit is as strong as you think. And this accelerates the shrinking of the market, a contraction basically. or what she calls like reduces it to the minimum consumption capacity. This is basically what she's basically walking us through, like what an economic crisis looks like. And she's pointing out every step. Credit makes everything worse. It does not help the situation.
Economics 101.
That's right. Yeah, to quote my very first presentation of Wage, Labor, and Capital, this book could also just as easily be called How I Learned to Stop Being a Liberal and Love Political Economy. So I'll keep moving. Next part. Do cartels or monopolies alleviate capitalism's tendency to collapse? Does anyone care to answer?
No.
Did we learn nothing from Lenin?
They don't. They literally.
Yeah, they don't.
What?
Hold on, Amex, you're breaking up there slightly.
Yeah, your mic is bugging out.
A little bit.
I said that they literally do the opposite by heightening the class struggle.
Yep, pretty much.
Martin Max Bog.
And this is I think this is a really nice pair of paragraphs, because she's pointing out again a few of these contradictions within capitalism, and walking us through why cartels or monopolies or whatever you want to call it, capitalist combinations, I think she also uses that term, it makes everything worse. It does not make the situation better. So she says that cartels aggravate the antagonism existing between the mode of production and exchange by sharpening the struggle between the producer and the consumer, as is the case especially in the US. So again, mode of production is how things are made. Exchange is you have to realize your profit by selling it. Now, I'll just ask the class here, so to speak. Does anyone remember what the contradiction between production and exchange, or sometimes known as production and realization? Does anyone want to give a quick reminder of what that contradiction is within capitalism?
We are all bad students.
Oh boy, here we go. Okay.
Boy, I remember that one, but I remember it in Arabic fully.
That's acceptable. So here it is in English. The contradiction between production and exchange is one of the fundamental ones that Marx spends a lot of time talking about in Capital, especially culminating in Volume 3. So the mode of production is making things, and that has to do, and this has to do with the realization of profit overall. This is what the contradiction is about. So the contradiction has to do with the fact that you have to make stuff and then sell it, and you have to make a profit somewhere in there. Now, the profit we know comes from what is effectively stolen labor, or surplus labor, surplus value. It's basically stolen surplus value. So you are underpaying your workers intentionally, so that you can sell the whatever commodity it is for a profit. But the ones who are usually buying your commodity are those very same workers. And if they are being paid less than the value of their labor, that means they do not have the money it takes to buy what they just produced. This is an obvious contradiction, because if I'm selling my commodity for $10, but I only pay my employee $8, they simply can't afford it. And that means I don't actually realize a $2 profit. I'm actually in the hole $10 until someone buys the damn thing. And so what I might be forced to do is, I mean, if I cut my prices down, that means I'm not making any money. If I increase prices, that just means even fewer people are going to buy it. So this is like one of the core contradictions within capitalism, because the ones who are doing the producing are also the ones doing the consuming. And she points out this is particularly bad in the U.S. And it is, because basically we as workers are not paid enough money to buy the things we're making. I mean, that's been a problem since the beginning of capitalism, pretty much. So that is that contradiction. And she says cartels aggravate this.
And you can see how, first of all, thank you, because I would never be able to formalize it like that. I am too dumb in English to do that. And second thing, you can see how they are trying to work around that through imperialism to basically sell their product to third world countries through, of course, imperialism, which would give them more profit than if they sold it locally. But you can see that the contradiction widens in third world countries, which leads to a collapse after collapse, which would lead later to them not being able to buy these products, which would lead to the same outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. When you do scale the contradiction up to the international level, this is pretty much exactly what Lenin was writing about in imperialism. Is just like how you have a one-way extraction of surplus value from wage labor to capital, you have the exact same thing happening with a one-way extraction of value from the so-called third world to the first world through imperialism. Basically, you can call it unequal exchange. That's kind of the same idea, really. It's just, again, we're moving from workers and capitalists to now just like, yeah, it still technically is workers and capitalists, really, but this also does happen on an international level. And another good point, I guess I'll just quickly comment on, because Amex brought it up, is that capitalism doesn't really ever avoid these contradictions, but it can move them around. It's able to shift where this contradiction might be happening. And so you're right. Workers in the first world might not see it as intensely. It might not be as obvious because it's happening halfway across the planet where we're not really conscious of it. And so we might not see that directly in front of our eyes, but it doesn't mean it's still not happening, because it is.
I think that's why most yeah, of course. But I think that's why when you're talking about credit in the third world, you see the answer always being the intensified class struggle, unlike the answer in the first world, because we already have more intense class struggle.
Yeah.
And
actually,
I am
I was going to say that basically gets us right to the next contradiction. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, I'm a good student. I just don't know English.
That's fine. I understand you well enough. But yes, that is a nice transition to this next antagonism, which I'll read as real quickly. So they aggravate furthermore the antagonism existing between the mode of production and the mode of appropriation by opposing in the most brutal fashion to the working class the superior force of organized capital, and thus increasing the antagonism between capital and labor. So this is, again, maybe the more well-known contradiction within capitalism, right, between capital and labor. Now, specifically, the mode of production here is referring to the fact that in capitalism, and especially through capitalist development, labor becomes more highly socialized especially compared to previous forms of production. All right, so think about, again, large-scale production takes a lot of people and they all need to be working in pretty tight-knit ways to make large-scale production happen. And that means that the workers are becoming more conscious of the fact that, hey, we're the ones making all this stuff, and we're the ones working together. And yet, we are opposed to the second part here, which is the mode of appropriation. We are not seeing the benefit of all this collective labor, right? That surplus value that's being generated doesn't go to the workers. It goes straight to the capitalists, and gets, recirculated. And when you have a monopoly or a cartel, this just gets worse, because now the workers have, there essentially is no longer a labor market in any sense of the word. There's one game in town, so to speak, where you can work, and so they can basically pay you as little as they think they can get away with. Because where else are you going to work, right? If there's only one gig, you're kind of stuck. So, yeah, that obviously heightens that antagonism, contradiction. And then finally, she says, capitalist combinations aggravate the contradiction existing between the international character of capitalist world economy and the national character of the state, insofar as they are always accompanied by a general tariff war, which sharpens the differences among the capitalist states. So again, this is something that Lenin talks about a little bit, right? Where, because the capitalist competition sort of spills out into the international stage, what you end up having is this weird conflict, because capital doesn't care about, it does care about its own state, insofar as it really wants the state to promote its interests, and yet it's fine working across state lines, because
just want the state to be stable enough so they don't lose all of their money, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Or basically that they have most of their means of production in their own state, which they need to be stable enough so the working class don't revolt and take the means of production to their own hands.
Yeah. And obviously, I would say, again, that Lenin's contribution to imperialism, especially when he mentions, right, imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism, him and Rosa are kind of talking about the same phenomenon here, right? These, again, she calls it capitalist combinations, but cartels, monopoly. The monopoly stage of capitalism is when this, when capital starts spilling into the international stage more and more, and that ends up causing conflict between large capitalist powers. That's what we're talking about, right? It's pretty distinct to the monopoly stage of capitalism. So anyways, yes, pretty clear answer to this question, I hope. No, it doesn't alleviate anything. Again, if anything, it makes the problems worse and more bombastic than they would be otherwise. Okay. All right, next chapter. The realization of socialism through social reforms. Let's just vote our way to socialism, guys.
Or as we call it, bullshit.
Well, a lot of what she's responding to is bullshit. So, but yes. Okay. So the question essentially posed is, can trade unions, social reforms, and political democracy lead to the progressive realization of socialism? So she points out for trade unions and specifically...
I know.
Yeah, no, not really. So
these are just concessions.
Right. It's just she points out the scope of trade unions specifically is limited essentially to a struggle for the increase of wages and the reduction of labor time. That is to say, to efforts at regulating capital's exploitation. But trade unions can in no way influence the process of production itself. So, again, she's not like 100% boo-hooing trade unions, because she does, obviously, they're trying to and she uses this word a lot, but it's a nice word, ameliorate the struggle of the working class. And so increasing their wages, and by the way, Marx just talked about this in Wage, Labor, and Capital, that ultimately it's still a good thing, but you're really not scratching the core of capitalism, which is the process of production.
Well, I would
Your
argue
union
that
is never going to seize the means of production.
Well, I would argue otherwise if you just give them Kalashnikovs.
Yeah, potentially.
I mean, you're giving them money. They might as well buy Kalashnikovs.
A brilliant plan.
I mean, that's kind of where the transition from, a broadly militant trade union organization transforms into something more like concretely militant, like a Soviet workers' council.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that the thing there is that you shouldn't let the union itself buy the weapons, quote unquote. And by that I mean making an army. But the vanguard party through the unions, because the goal of the vanguard party is to lead the unions into, fucking up the system.
Yeah. And I think she does point out pretty clearly, like, if the goal of your union organizing is to basically only struggle for increasing wages or reducing labor time, if that's the end all be all, that's just reformism, right? I mean, you just want a slightly bigger crumb or a little more crumbs than you had before.
I think that was the point that I was kind of trying to make, is that when it transforms into that real revolutionary force, then it ceases to simply be a union, and it transforms into something more akin to a vanguard.
Absolutely. All right.
Anyway, go
on this. So next part here has to do with social reforms, right? So this is referring to, let's work within the system to change the system, and this is just usually referring to some sort of bourgeois democracy or parliament or whatever. So she says, we know that the present state is not society representing the rising working class. It is itself the representative of capitalist society. It is a class state. Therefore, its reform measures are not an application of social control. They are forms of control applied by the class organization of capital to the production of capital. The so-called social reforms are enacted in the interests of capital. So, again, this is sort of echoing a lot of, well, actually, I guess this was written slightly before State and Revolution, but again, echoing very similar ideas about the Marxist conception of the state, that it is a tool of class domination, basically. Yeah. And that ultimately the state, it's because it is an organ of class domination, it is always going to enact reforms that are in the interest of capital, even if the crumbs are slightly bigger. For example, like increasing the minimum wage or something like that. Usually that's only going to be enacted if it's sort of like a last-ditch effort to prevent some sort of massive revolt. And yeah, I think someone mentioned it earlier. They're almost always going to be in the form of concessions. And if they are concessions being given, which they are, that means they can always be taken away. And I think we've seen that play out over the course of the 20th century, even into the 21st century, right?
I mean, this is literally what is happening with the minimum wage in the United States of America, where most minimum wage workers can't afford to live. Therefore, you can see the revolutionary what do you call it, spirit in the minimum wage workers. That's why you can see a push against them, first of all, from the right to basically ground them, while you see from the push from the left, quote unquote, to basically ground them too by giving them some concessions. I mean, $15 as a minimum wage won't even let you live in America. You need at least $24 an hour, but you can still see how that is impossible. For it would mean that their the falling rates of profit is so great in America that they cannot continue like that. As I see it, in the future of the United States, if it would still continue to exist, it would continue to exist throughout a economic shutdown and an economic restart, like what happened in the Great Depression and what happened in the, I think, Nixon era.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there is something that has been confusing me for quite a while. I have been trying to understand the falling rate of profit concept, but haven't really gotten a good grasp on it. So, do you think you'd be able to maybe have some club meeting just related to that or something? I think that would be a pretty good idea.
I mean, yeah, I can explain it to you real quick.
That would be nice. Yes.
Yeah, so the capitalist gets their money through exploiting the working class. Well, they would have to give the working class more so they can realize more in profit. But at the same time, they get to the point where their profit at a product isn't $1, but a cent. And when they get to this point, they cannot pay more for the working class to consume more. Neither can they make the product more expensive. This is the falling rates of profit. Instead of $1 for profit for a product, you have a cent in profit, which would lead them to be unable to enact in a case of a economic disaster, as what happened in the 30s and what is happening right now.
Thank you for that.
Yep. I was going to say that is one of the causes of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. The other one that Marx cites has to do with technological innovation, especially or specifically technological innovations that reduce the amount of labor. The amount of labor it takes to make something. And so you can
they
extend
will
this to
not be able to. They will not be able to basically pay more people. So the same thing would happen basically.
Mm-hmm. Where specifically does he write about this? I'm assuming in Capital he does.
Yep.
Do you know where?
Yep, Capital Volume 1. I think Wage, Labor, and Capital a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
As well, yeah. But
do you know the chapter?
Not off the top of my head, I don't.
Yeah.
For at least Capital.
6 and 7.
That sounds right. I know it's pretty early because I've only read about the first third of Capital, but I've read it, so yeah, that sounds right. I think 6 and 7 sounds right. The quick and dirty version is basically like I usually go to the thought experiment, right, where we're pretty familiar that like call them like artisanal handmade crafts are usually more expensive because they took a lot of like hours to produce. And you can think of a sort of imaginary commodity that takes 0 like human labor hours to produce, which would basically be a perpetual engine type hypothetical, but just go with me, right? basically, if there's a commodity that can essentially
We invented
self-replicate.
Bitcoin.
No, I mean, that still takes coal and energy to exist in some sort of cloud. But just to pretend like there's some magical self-replicating commodity. There can literally be an infinite number of this particular commodity. It can just replicate freely, no materials required, no energy required, no human input required. Wouldn't that logically cost nothing? I mean, you can just get as many of it as you want with no effort expended by anybody. And so that is basically what automation is trending towards, is less and less labor required to make things. You can mass produce things using essentially just a shit ton of energy and materials, but not as many humans, right? That's what automation is all about. And so what Marx points out is that because there is less socially necessary labor embodied in the commodity, its value is decreasing. Therefore, the amount of profit that you can realize is also decreasing. So
I would argue that you can see that basically on the internet by looking at the what do you call it, the videos that take really little effort to make, and or nothing in case of AI that is coming up that will generate views and therefore profit.
Yeah. So yeah, there's multiple contradictions, excuse me, that contribute to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And that is why it's kind of called a tendency and not a law necessarily, is because the capitalist class especially is very conscious of these trends. Believe me, they have the numbers. They know what will lead to less money and what won't. And that usually it has to do with, especially when in the field of automation, right, is that automation, the reason you might pursue technology or automation is for like a temporary boost to your competitive advantage. So you have like a very temporary window of increased profits. But then once everyone else in your field catches up and starts using the same technology, well, then you just lost your advantage and your profits start to fall again. And so it's like they're basically, it's like the dog chasing its own tail. You know, they're never really going to. They're always trying to increase their profits, but it's always another way of thinking of it, actually. So, right, we all think of capital as like something that has to feed and constantly grow. I almost think of like the rate of profit to fall, that tendency, as like hunger for like a human being or some sort of living animal. It's always getting hungry. Like you're always burning energy, and yet you have to constantly consume more energy to refill the tanks, so to speak. It's like entropy, but applied to political economy.
Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah, you basically have a infinite tendency of the rates of profit to fall, which means that the ruling class won't enact on economic problems because they are not realizing profit out of it, which would mean to the smallest of problems to be the end of the world, as we saw in 2008.
Yep. I also point out that so a lot of bourgeois economics people will basically point out that like, oh, well, like the rate of profit has been increasing, so on and so forth. So there are reasons for why profit might spike for periods of time. And one of the
such as automation.
Well, yeah, but usually automation is only for like one.
Well, yeah, as you
industry, or like it's temporary. It's very temporary.
It is a boost for some.
There is actually an even stronger correlation, though, with massive increases in the number of workers. Now, this has happened historically. One example that you can point to is the mobilization of women into the workforce in like far, far greater numbers than they had been historically. And if you think about it, that effectively doubles your working population. If you're thinking of it from the capitalist perspective of, I need more workers to exploit because that's my source of value. That's where I'm extracting capital from. Now, think about it. You can only double your working population by just bringing half the population into the workforce suddenly. You can really only do that once. And then you're stuck from there. The next big introduction was specifically China, basically reopening up their country to foreign capital as sort of like a center of production for the world, right? The world's factory sort of deal. Again, that's like a huge influx of available labor for capital to exploit, on the order of probably close to 1 billion people. Let's call it like quick math. What would that be? I'm trying to do the math around the 80s or 90s. Let's call it like 20% increase in the workforce. Again, that's a huge sudden increase that did probably looked great on paper, right? They're probably making hand over fist because now we have this huge population we can exploit that we weren't able to exploit previously. But again, you can only really do that once. And now that we're in it, capital's at the current time we're talking is basically exploiting like as many people as it possibly can right now. Right? I can't really, other than like children, as sadistic as that sounds, other than children, who is left on the planet for capital to exploit?
Dude, they're already trying that.
Yes,
Yeah,
not only in America, everywhere.
They've always been trying, but that's my point. Is that
been working since I was 12 years old. Yeah, they did that already.
Yeah,
it's time to mobilize newborns.
Yeah. I mean, that's what. But that's
Get
what
those
you can
old
think
guys
about.
You
back
can
as
see
well.
that.
You gotta bring him back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People
You can see that in the boom and bust cycle of the. Yes, sir.
Watch them make new technology just to like mobilize disabled people to also work for them.
Yes.
America invents exosuits just to get disabled.
They have literally done that. They are doing that.
I was gonna say
they're already trying to do that.
I know quite a bit of. I'm actually legally blind, so I know quite a bit of what
No
they're doing.
way. Messing around? Are you kidding me? I swear.
No, it's dead serious.
I would point to strengthen this point. I would point out to the bust cycle of the population of a certain country, in which when they get to a certain point, their population starts to decline, and with the decline of the populations, you can see the rates of profit decline with it, as what happened in Britain, for example. While in America now, the population starting to decline, you can see the pushback from big capital against that, because they are in a point where they have red marks.
Well, we can point to another contemporary example, at least in the U.S., although I know it's not exclusive to the U.S., is the real rapid restriction of abortion rights. Because think about it, from the perspective of capital, you need more workers, like ASAP.
That's what I'm saying.
You need more people to squeeze profit out of. And if people have access to contraception or abortion, any sort of reproductive health, and especially if they're being properly educated and able to make decisions for themselves, that's no good for capital. No. We want a nice big workforce to exploit, preferably as like as less educated as we can have them.
Poor people don't need to make decisions.
Yeah.
And,
Again,
like you,
Exactly.
So, yeah.
I remember studying
And
countries.
yeah.
Like countries
No, go on.
will, like, when they get desperate, start taking in immigrants, a shit ton of them.
Mhm.
Then that causes
Germany. I would just say Germany.
Yeah, then
Germany and
that
Canada.
causes its own
Sweden
issues
as well.
with bringing that. Like, you want to exploit the third world? What are you going to do? Bring them all into your country? Then just, like, fuck yourself over because you just brought the problem
American
that you could
politicians
put
are
across
gonna
the
be
world
like-
into your own borders?
Well, yeah, because the working the third worlders that just came to Canada, for example, won't demand for a high pay, especially at first, but later they will see that, hey, everyone is getting paid but me, so how about I demand I get paid the same, which would lead to the same problem just continuing.
Yeah.
You can. I had a point and I forgot it completely. Another big example is the cultural push from the right to see women at home. You would say, well, that would decrease the rates of profit. But as they see it in our time and our modern medicine, a woman at home can push out 7 babies. That's why they are trying to push that to be a norm.
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah,
I hope we answered your question quickly in half an hour.
that's right. Just a couple hundred years of study behind it. No big deal.
A pamphlet.
It's how leftists interact. It's all right.
Right. All right. Let's keep it going then. All right. So next, capitalism and the state. Can the state, through democracy, rein in capitalism and bring about socialism? All right. I'll just get into the quote real quick before we discuss further. In this society, the capitalist society is. Let me read this real quick. Anyways.
Can I give you a quote first? No, you can continue now.
Okay, thank you. Very insightful. The representative institutions, democratic in form, are in content the instruments of the interests of the ruling class. This manifests itself in a tangible fashion in the fact that as soon as democracy shows the tendency to negate its class character and become transformed into an instrument for the real interests of the population, the democratic forms are sacrificed by the bourgeoisie and by its state representatives. So again, even if in this scenario, if you do see your democracy in some sort of democratic republic, basically, if the working class does happen to, like she says, negate its class character, like somehow the working class is able to maintain political or attain political power, the bourgeoisie is going to be like, yeah, no, we're done with that. We're just going to throw out democracy because it's not giving us the results we want. And that's because they're the ones that are really in control, basically. The democracy is, again, this is another Lenin quote, but, democracy in bourgeois society is mirrors that of the democracy in the Greek and Roman republics, democracy for the slave owners, right? If you own everything, then democracy sounds great, but as soon as the poors start getting what they want, then democracy goes out the window. And unfortunately, I think, and Rosa would unfortunately be one of the victims of this. This is a large part of what I think the fascist reaction is all about. It's oh no, the poors are getting way too class conscious and are starting to get to the point where they might actually seize political control. So we're just going to throw democracy out the window and not do that anymore. And just install essentially an overt dictatorship of the bourgeoisie versus a covert dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Okay, any more comments before I move on?
I mean, just on that note, yeah, that literally almost happened with the business plot in the 30s, because back then, you know, the like more radical labor movement was still alive and kicking.
Yeah.
Democracy grows out of a barrel of a gun.
Well, and yeah, sometimes, right, it won't necessarily take the form of, or, you know, as leftists, we know this happens all the time. Oh no, like a democratically elected socialist leader, or at least even if it's just socialist, like or someone who's sympathetic to socialism, or even just progressive politics, what can we expect them to find in probably a few months? Probably the fucking CIA trying to coup them out of existence and replace them with some military dictatorship of some kind.
Some freedom and democracy, brother.
That's right. I mean, they might give, what's it called? Can't think of the word. I don't know. They'll basically wax poetic about, oh, we want to spread democracy, blah, 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 right? You know, oh, we love spreading democracy and freedom all over the world. But as soon as that democracy starts showing some class consciousness and maybe anti-imperialist, you know, tendencies, you can almost guarantee they're going to get cooed into existence, or
Not
out of
even
existence.
that.
Yeah. Anyways.
Like, if you just nationalize your oil, you'll get all F-forward.
Yeah. They might even just uninstall you, actually. Literally.
True.
So, yeah, this, again.
Did I hear nationalize your oil?
Yeah. That's right.
Nationalize my oil.
Well, the thing is that democracy doesn't matter, not in a sense that if you sell your product in your own currency, that is enough for them to kick you out of your existing order. That's how the Iraq invasion started, because actually Iraq wanted to sell the Iraqi oil with the Iraqi dinar. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a pretty easy one to debunk from the liberal on the walls, who basically says, oh, we can simply vote better policies in and things will be better. It's like, well, if
would you please shut up?
It's like, how many examples do you need to be shown of that not happening to be convinced?
Like fucking pick up a book, you know?
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's one of those things where it's like, is it like a logical impossibility? No. It is a practical impossibility. Basically, the ruling class just won't let it happen. Willingly, they're not just going to roll over, basically. Like, that's what we're trying to say here. They're not just going to roll over and let it happen. That's not what they're doing. That's not why they're called the ruling class.
It is a logical impossibility too, but like it is for a different time when you're talking to somebody who actually has logic. Because usually at this point we'll go with liberals who have the absolutely zero logic.
I suppose so. I guess it's more like, okay, in a fantasy world, could the ruling class just roll over and be like, oh no, I've been voted out of power. This sucks. I guess I'll just leave now. It's like, okay, yeah, theoretically, maybe in some fantasy novel that might happen. But that's not what happens in real life. They're going to push back and snuff out democracy as soon as it doesn't give them what they want. So, anyways. Let's keep going. That one's pretty cut and dry. Okay. The general nature of reformism. So this is a nice kind of summary of the first two chapters. So I'll just read through this really quick. We may say that the theory of revisionism occupies an intermediate place between two extremes. Revisionism does not expect to see the contradictions of capitalism mature. It does not propose to suppress these contradictions through a revolutionary transformation. It wants to lessen, attenuate the capitalist contradictions. Thus, the antagonism existing between production and exchange is to be mollified by the cessation of crises and the formation of capitalist combines. The antagonism between capital and labor is to be adjusted by bettering the situation of the workers and by the conservation of middle classes. And the contradiction between the class, state, and society is to be liquidated through increased state control and the progress of democracy. So again, this is summarizing the reformist arguments of, oh, those contradictions, the ones that are fundamental to capitalism's operation, yeah, those are actually fine. We can just, buff them out a little bit, make it all smooth, and make everyone happy. The working class and the capitalist class can just get along.
If you don't think about it, it is really a perfect world that we live in.
That's right. There's nothing wrong here, folks. It's just the capitalists being a little too greedy. If only we could just share the love a little more, share the wealth.
It's just a few bad apples. That's all it is.
It's going to trickle down.
Yeah, or that one. I mean, that's the most ludicrous version of it. Oh, it'll just trickle down on its own. Yeah. But yeah, that's a quick summary of what we've been talking about. So, all right. Next, economic development and socialism. Is socialism merely a political goal, or is it the result of the economic development of society? So this is getting a little more into the theoretical departure of revisionism or reformism versus sort of orthodox Marxist theories. So she says social democracy sees socialism, and just so everyone is aware, the social democracy, when she's talking about that basically refers to the Communist Party in Germany, I'm pretty sure. It sees socialism as a result of economic necessity and the comprehension of that necessity leading to the suppression of capitalism by the working masses. And she does add that honestly pretty important caveat there, right? So, I mean, this is something I think that often gets a little misinterpreted in especially Marxist theory is we can basically just sit around and socialism will just magically happen one day. Because I mean, they do use words like it's a necessity of history, it's inevitable, these sorts of wordings. But this is actually a pretty interesting clarification about that, right? It's that the comprehension of the necessity of socialism is what will actually bring it about. We need people to be conscious of this shit. They have to know about it.
That's why we would say that the primary objective of even a vanguard party is to educate people.
That's right. Educate and agitate. Yeah, and this is part of what makes capitalism so tough is its tendency to obscure a lot of the otherwise pretty obvious glaring contradictions. Is that, whether it be the expropriation of labor or the money form, for example, a lot of this does obfuscate what's really happening under the hood. And so, we need theories and these scientific explanations of what's happening to really cut through the fog, the mystification of and get to really what's what's actually happening. Because really, when you get down to it, it's like, it's really not that complicated. Ultimately, it's just like, hey, listen, guys, we're all being stolen from, and a very small minority of the human beings on this planet are living off of the other 7 to 8 billion or whatever. And that's also leading to the planet dying at a rapid pace. So let's just like cut that out, please. So yeah, kind of connecting those dots is pretty key towards the movement. Then secondly, she says, the secret of Marx's theory of value and his analysis of the problem of money and his theory of capital, of the theory of the rate of profit, and consequently of the entire existing economic system is found in the transitory character of capitalism and the inevitability of its collapse, leading, and this is only another aspect of the same phenomenon, to socialism. It is only because Marx looked at capitalism from a socialist viewpoint, that is, a historic viewpoint, that he was able to decipher the hieroglyphics of capitalist economy. So again, just kind of pointing out where the revisionist theory and Marxist theory diverges is that revisionists do not have a very historic perspective of things. They're kind of too fixated on the here and now to take a larger view of what came before capitalism and what might come after. Okay. Next, talk about cooperatives, unions, and democracy. So, the question is, are co-ops a means of achieving socialism? If we have any fans of Richard Wolff, he famously really likes to hype up co-ops. So, yeah.
I would say absolutely fucking no.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, was someone else speaking?
What's that one in Spain he always loves to mention?
Oh, Mondragon.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so, well, here, I'll just read this.
I would argue that to have a co-op, you either need a large working class with enough capital to start a business, and or to force businesses to convert into co-ops, which will never happen because you need a political economic force to do that. That's why the answer is absolutely fucking not.
Yeah, I always felt like cooperatives never really could exist unless you broke down the systems that were like making them not viable. Like in the United States, co-ops are just not a thing, and you're not going to see actual co-ops because they're just get beaten out by the capitalists.
Even if it is possible to have a co-op, it is impossible for a co-op for everyone to work at a co-op in a capitalist system, because not everyone have enough capital to participate in the creation of a co-op.
I did want to mention, we actually do, I totally agree with you on pretty much most points, but I would like to mention we actually do have a few successful co-ops in the US, though I believe a few of them have a more hierarchical approach and they're still not very egalitarian. Ocean Spray is a really good example, though.
Yeah, exactly. But I would say that this is way more possible in the imperial core for the working classes, way more rich.
That depends on what you consider a co-op. I mean, fucking REI calls itself a co-op, and yet they're like hardcore anti-union, fucking not like actually like egalitarian profit sharing or any of that. Anyone can call themselves a co-op if they have like a certain degree of like shareholder benefits to their employees. And I would imagine that Ocean Spray is probably similar.
Yeah, I've even seen read a few articles about like the portrayal of Mondragon is sometimes more rosy than the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I've heard a number of things about that as well.
Yeah, and I'll quickly go over because this paragraph I quote is sort of like a little bit of a conclusion. So just to preface it really quickly from what she says in the text. So she does point out, just like what you said, right? Cooperatives are not likely to be highly competitive because why would the workers want to just brutally exploit themselves? That's not super likely. So what she says, the best situation for a cooperative on the production side of things, so they're the ones making something. Their best situation is where they have a cooperative on the consumer side, right? So this is where you basically have like a consumer group that sort of agrees to just buy from a consumer or a cooperative producer. And so you've got this like marriage between and this agreement between the producers and the consumers. And she's saying like, while that might sound great, it's basically highly unstable. And you know, we're all pretty familiar with it. Like the good old fashioned ruthless capitalist is probably going to make that cooperative have a pretty bad time.
Yeah, and even if it had a great time, you still haven't gotten to the point that you were trying to get to in the first place, which is socialism. You're just working under capitalism. You have alleviated some suffering from a certain group. The other groups are still suffering. You did absolutely nothing. It's just like some people going to live in a commune and then saying we are helping.
Yeah. Yep. So, well, all right. So let me read this summary paragraph, I suppose, that she puts out. So she says, cooperatives and trade unions are totally incapable of transforming the capitalist mode of production. Bernstein is dimly aware of this, for he refers to co-ops and trade unions as a means of reducing the profit of the capitalists and thus enriching the workers. In this way, he renounces the struggle against the capitalist mode of production and attempts to direct the socialist movement towards the struggle against capitalist distribution. Again and again, Bernstein refers to socialism as an effort towards a fair, equitable, and more equitable mode of distribution. So again, this is very much like the last few slides, right? Where Bernstein is trying to, and these basically reformist efforts are trying to basically shift the focus of the movement away from the productive sphere and towards just the distribution of wealth, basically. Like, oh, if only we could just redistribute money. And we see this, unfortunately, caricatured. Like this is one of the most common caricatures of socialism that we probably see day in and day out, right? It's sort of like, oh, well, like you have $20,000 to your name. Why don't you just evenly distribute it to everyone you know? Wouldn't that be what a socialist does? It's like, no, that's not what we're talking about. And the saddest thing about it is that these types of ridiculous arguments are coming from these old school guys like Bernstein, who unfortunately did call themselves socialists. And you know, this is a really unfortunate, long-lasting negative consequence of this silliness. Is we still live with the consequences today of the liberal caricature of socialism. Is just, oh, we should just read all this money that we've stolen from everyone. Let's just redistribute it in a way that seems more fair. Like, no, that's not at all what we're really getting at. We're getting at the mode of production, not just distribution.
I mean, really, if they want to keep their money and their liquidated assets and give us their means of production, I really don't see that as a problem. Even if the liquidated assets of Elon Musk, for example, are $7 billion, I don't see that like money even have any value in exchange for the means of production themselves.
That is actually one of the funnier, I guess you could say, counter arguments I've heard before, where people are like, you do know that Elon doesn't literally have like $100 billion in cash, right? That's all assets. That's all. That's like the stuff. It's the physical capital that they own. And I'm like, yeah, that is what I want. I want the means of production. I don't give a fuck about his cash. Yeah, and not to mention that, like, as we are gradually moving away from cash, I think altogether, like literally physical money entirely, it becomes even more meaningless. It's just zeros and ones at a certain point, right? And so, yeah, you can keep all the zeros and ones you want. I just want the fucking machines and
the greedy,
the real shit.
Tesla mega factory.
Pray to Allah that all the zeros and ones turn into zeros.
Yeah, wouldn't that be the swindle of all time? It's just be like, hey, Elon, I will give you so many zeros behind your net wealth, like as many zeros as you can think of, as long as you give me all of your stuff, all the factories,
exactly.
All the workers are now the owners of your
you get the whole
factories and shit.
Dude.
See, this liberal sentiment of let's take the money and leave the means of production is exactly the way that they protect themselves with, right? Because taking $6 billion, the $6 or $7 billion that Elon Musk have in liquid money is nothing in comparison to the $330 billion that he have in assets and means of production.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and I would say there is a pretty big difference between your average liberal who isn't actually a capitalist at all. They don't own shit.
Yeah,
they just
but
like
they are
money.
But
they don't understand what's happening. But the actual capitalists, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say they do understand the game. Like they do know that their greatest asset is in fact the means of production, and that's how they keep us all dependent on the system.
If you don't think that Jeff Bezos have read Capital, you're a liberal.
Hasn't he? I think is it Bezos who has actually said he's read Marx?
I think
he actually has.
Of course he has.
I don't remember, but of course he has. All of them have.
I mean, probably not like Elon Musk, but
no, Elon Musk
seems
is
like
too
the
dumb
type
to
who
read.
would say he has, but actually hasn't. The Bezos,
probably.
I believe,
he read
actually
the
has.
Spark Notes.
No, but Bezos is a more cunning brand of evil.
A little bit.
There's the whole. I mean, we talk about it too, knowing your enemy, and of course they read these theories. I mean, there's that American general a while back at a press conference that talked about having read Mao and Lenin and Stalin and shit. It's like, yeah, of course they teach these people these things.
Actually, isn't it like it's one of the, I don't remember which officer academy it is in the U.S. because there's like different branches of them, but one of the officer academies has a class where they literally study what's it called, guerrilla warfare by Che.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like, they're studying our stuff for sure.
The difference is that they're trying to use this knowledge for evil.
Yeah, obviously they are, and that's the thing. Like they acknowledge, just like we do, that putting theory into practice and then learning from that is invaluable. You can't. Putting stuff into practice.
It's not just for communists, unfortunately.
Exactly. Well, that's what on practice I think is all about, right? It's once you put your theories into practice and learn from them, that's the real sauce.
And that's why I would argue we need to read some bourgeois books at some points in our education to be able to recognize their ideas. Like just learning a packaged answer to every question they have in their tree of questioning isn't enough, I would argue, because a machine can do that. Remember the Chinese room example. The thing is that you need to fundamentally understand how they think and fundamentally understand the communist way of thinking to actually give a good answer to whatever bullshit question they will throw at you.
Speaking of like bourgeois books, I think you got Nick mentioned it in a podcast, Propaganda by Edward Bernays.
Yeah, and the Republic of Walmart, shit like that.
I'm totally down to read a bourgeois book.
Yeah. I mean, let's understand our stuff first. I think we should read more comic books.
Yeah, well,
okay, let's continue.
A little of both. I mean, obviously, I would even say this is a good example of because Luxemburg is responding to Bernstein, who is, let's just say, bourgeois, like to his core. I mean, he's really is. He might be. He's socialism. He's socialist in name, but he's self-identified as socialist, but really his arguments are pretty milquetoast bourgeois liberal shit. So, especially nowadays,
I self-identify as a billionaire.
Yeah. So I think works like this one are actually pretty good for learning both sides of the argument, or learning what the original argument was from the liberal side, and then exactly how to counter it. So yeah. Okay. Next, I think there's only a couple more slides. The conquest of political power. Is revolution just the fast track to political power, and reform is just a slower way of getting to the same place? That is the question posed here. Now, she will answer it by saying, work for reform does not contain its own force, independent of revolution. During every historic period, the work for reform is carried on only in the direction given by the impetus of the previous revolution, and continues as long as the impulse from that revolution continues to make itself felt. Or, to put it more concretely, in each historic period, work for reforms is carried on only in the framework of the social form created by the previous revolution. That is the kernel of the problem. I'll just read the second part real fast. Our program becomes not the realization of social. This is she's saying the second part I should clarify. She's saying if we accept Bernstein's argument. So if we accept that, our program becomes not the realization of socialism, but the reform of capitalism. Not the suppression of the wage labor system, but the diminution of exploitation, that is, the suppression of the abuses of capitalism instead of the suppression of capitalism itself. Right? So she's pointing out that as soon as you take on the track of reformism, you are accepting the framework of the current social system. Like, social, economic, political system. You are accepting the terms and conditions, and you are basically tacitly agreeing not to escape those constraints, right? As soon as you go into reform, you are accepting the status quo, and you're almost conscious or subconsciously accepting that, and you agree, no. Capitalism isn't so bad. We can just reform it, but it's still, it's still capitalism. It's still in the framework of capitalism. That's what it means to reform. It's not to change the fundamental framework. So yeah. Oh, look, it's Layla. She finally made it. Hello. Yeah.
Working within the system is basically the Like, I don't think that you need to stretch anything out to say that working within the system is accepting the terms and conditions of the system. And
Yep, that's kind of answers the question, right? Is that no, revolutionary reform are not just, let's say, two trains on the same track heading in the same place. Like, no. The revolution train is preferably a rather quick track. That's what we want. But reform is not even heading in the same direction. It's not even moving towards the same goals.
Yeah, we're changing the terms and conditions of the deal by having a revolution, unlike the fundamental failures of the reformist.
Yep.
I believe it was Malcolm X after they have the big reforms that were passed, and he was like, "I'll never say that we won."
Well, yeah, exactly,
I got a
because
better one.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nikolai. What were you saying?
I'm trying to find it. It was a Malcolm X quote. There it is. Hang on. A man who tosses worms in the river isn't necessarily a friend of the fish. All the fish who take him for a friend, who think the worms got no hook to it, usually end up in the frying pan. Essentially, that's what reformism.
All right.
Anyway,
I'll keep going. Yeah, almost there. Will capitalism, or sorry, this is all about collapse. Will capitalism simply progressively proceed towards socialism without first collapsing upon itself? And she basically answers immediately no. Without the collapse of capitalism, the expropriation of the capitalist class is impossible. When he, meaning Bernstein, speaks of the general human character of liberalism and transforms socialism into a variety of liberalism, he deprives the socialist movement of its class character, and consequently of its historic content, consequently of all content. Conversely, he recognizes the class representing liberalism in history, the bourgeoisie, as the champion of the general interests of humanity. Again, I kind of picked this one out just because this drives me absolute batshit every time I hear anything close to it, where it's like, oh, you're just super far left, you're liberal, like, or you're very liberal because you're a socialist. It's like, no.
Yeah, if I hear that, I most likely punch the person. I'm sorry, I'm too aggressive, but like you know that, like calling a communist a liberal is just like the biggest insult you can ever insult someone.
Yeah.
I get called a fucking liberal almost every day, and it irritates the absolute fucking piss out of me.
Yeah.
Well, I punched people enough that nobody is able to call me liberal because they have tasted the punch. I would argue that this is the method for change.
That sounds effective.
Then how about we do it on a larger scale, maybe with
sounds pretty good.
communal work.
Now you're talking.
Maybe instead of just punching you by some Molotovs and some Kalashnikovs, and instead of like making them call us communists, we change the system. What would you call that? Maybe this is the reformist side that I would take.
Yeah, well, and so I guess I'll just quickly conclude. This whole chapter is about basically the idea that capitalism kind of, what's it called? What's that quote from Marx? It's like capitalism produces, above all else, its own grave diggers, I think is the quote roughly. And
they sell us the robes that we hang them with.
well, that's a Lenin one. Yeah, that's a good one too. It's like, or is it? It's like the last capitalist will be the one that sells us the rope that hangs them, or something like that. Yeah, same idea though. Same idea. Go ahead.
Google says it's what the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. That's what Google says.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Google is bourgeois.
So yeah, the idea here, right, is that, right, we know capitalism tends to fall in these massive crises, and that is essentially like the perfect soil for revolutionary movements to take advantage of when, kick it while it's down, so to speak. And yeah, so that's essentially what they're talking about there is, right, because if you are one of these reformists who just says, nah, capitalism's good to go, it's never going to fall, it's never going to create the conditions for its own destruction, then you're basically just like, no, it's like one of those, it's a little bit like, you're just like, yeah, no, it's the end of history, right? Capitalism is here to stay forever. It's never gonna fall, never gonna fail. So yeah, we don't accept that.
Then why you do a reset? Yeah, so the fetus. Then why you do a reset for capitalism every 50 years in America, Steve?
Well, also we have like a very consistent pattern of it completely shitting itself every 10 to 12 years or something.
8 to 12 in a international level, and I think 6 to 10 in a national level, but not in America.
Well, I mean, the large general crises, I think, is on average like 10 years or something. So, yeah. That's not to say that there are not smaller crises all the fucking time, because there are.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, the large one is in average 10 years, but the really ginormous ones happens one every 50 years, as we saw in the 30s, in the 80s, and now.
Right, 30s. It was like late 70s or 80s, and then that means we're. Let me check my watch. Oh yeah, we're due for one, for a big one.
Yeah, not really over two. It is in like a year or so. It started in, I think. Yeah, no. It started in. Yeah. It's perfect time for it to start. 32 and then 82 until I think Nixon was the president in 84, when he stopped basically put an overhaul on the economy to stop inflation that rose up to 13.5%, and then he basically restarted the economy because it's a dumb product, like every product capitalism have ever gave us, and now we're having the same thing.
Yeah, 74 would have been Nick. 74 would have been Nixon. 84 is Reagan.
Oh, Reagan.
Yeah.
Reagan, that piece of shit.
Yeah, I always interpreted the really big downturn to be late 70s, and then Reagan was like a reaction to that.
Well,
like the neoliberal kind of counter-revolution, if you want to call it that.
This is the thing, right? It starts earlier than the actual So it is basically a combination between two cycles of bust in the economy, which lead to that. The first cycle started in the late 70s, and the second cycle started, I think, 81, when the economy hasn't rose up yet, which led to a soaring inflation and an overhaul on the economy.
Yeah, well, it was like what was stag? That's what they called stagflation, right? What was that?
I don't know. I just know that what I think Reagan did.
What was the question?
The stagflation crisis, I think.
Yeah, that's when there's
Yeah, that was the 70s.
rising inflation, but a recession. Yeah.
Yeah, this is dumb name. Please don't name anything else. Fucking American.
A really fucking
This is why economists are terrible. This is why, never take economists seriously. They're awful.
Yeah. But basically,
they don't know how to name
since
anything.
we are living in another period of pretty intense inflation, and then what you see is like you got fucking central banks like the Fed are basically like, hey, you know what we should do to prevent inflation is intentionally cause a massive economic crisis by jacking interest rates up. And so they are in, like, it's almost like very overt. Like they don't even really, they're not even trying to hide it at this point. They're just like, yeah, we're trying to crash the economy.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, you have to understand that that if inflation just continued, you would see the Weimar Republic, basically, of America, where to buy an egg you need, I think, 3 billion marks.
That's the thing, right? Is that the crash is like the escape pod for the capitalists.
Exactly.
Right. That's basically, they're putting all of the economic misery onto the working class, so they don't have to experience it themselves. Although I understand inflation would also be really bad for the work. I mean, listen, pretty much any crisis, the working class gets it fucking raw versus the capitalists are usually fine.
Yeah, and you have to keep in mind that you can come back from a economic disaster and stagnation way easier than a inflation.
Yeah, plus I think the other issue is inflation would pretty severely delegitimize the dollar on the international stage, which would really threaten U.S. hegemony, and that's another aspect that they really don't want.
Yeah, and
so better to just throttle the entire economy than let the dollar inflate out of control. So, yep, the bourgeoisie is the champion of humanity, everyone. Remember what Bernstein said.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of humanity that I would genocide.
All right, last one. Opportunism in theory and practice. So, again, this is sort of like just a conclusion chapter a little bit. Going over a lot of the other stuff. So, but this is a nice paragraph where she roasts Bernstein pretty well. So she says, Bernstein's theory is the first and at the same time last attempt to give a theoretical basis to opportunism. It is last because in Bernstein's system, opportunism has gone negatively through its renunciation of scientific socialism, positively through its marshalling of every bit of theoretical confusion possible as far as it can. In Bernstein's book, Opportunism has crowned its theoretical development and has reached its ultimate conclusion. That conclusion basically being, don't worry, everyone, capitalism is fine. No need to overthrow anybody or anything.
Yeah, just don't think about it.
Yeah, we can fix what ails you.
I can fix her.
It's kind of like treating the symptoms instead of the disease. That's pretty much opportunism in a nutshell.
Don't worry, guys. If we just tape all of these holes with duct tape, surely they'll stop appearing.
Yeah.
Except the duct tape is like water soluble, so it's just gonna fucking dissolve anyways.
No, it's just receipt paper. Yeah.
It is not Flex Seal.
Yeah.
You gotta be cheap.
It's produced by the capitalists, so it is cheap.
Okay, well that's an hour and 45 on the vidya because we had a lot of discussion throughout it. So I'm just gonna stop the recording there. So good job, everybody.